So, mushrooms, toxic relationships. All we need is a little rock and roll, and this is going to feel like my high school years. I'm Brad Wolf, and welcome to Dired In, where we talk about tabletop RPGs and D&D. And I often hear people talk about statting a monster. How do you stat this monster? How do you stat that monster? And in large part, I'll tell you that that's kind of a fool's errand. You never have to build a monster from the ground up. You never have to create your own stat block. So today, we're talking about reflavoring monsters to make them usable in your game and not feel the same as another monster you've already used. And I'm going to give you 6 ways to do it and 2 examples for each way. By the time we're done, we'll have 12 monsters that you can use in your game, and all 12 of those monsters fit around a central theme that you can build a faction out of for your campaign setting as well. Let's get started. So the first method is to reskin the monster. You're keeping the exact same ability scores and monster abilities. All you're doing is changing the appearance and the description of the abilities. The actual mechanics behind the ability work exactly the same. You're just describing it in a new and evocative way. So I want to create a cult of Zuckmoy, the demon queen of rot, decay, and fungi. My friends and I were recently joking about her because she got the best glow up of any AD&D creature. This is what she looked like back then, and this is what she looks like now. Much improved. So, inspired by that conversation, I'm going to use the Cult of Zuckmoy as my example for this video. So for my first example, I want some Last of Us style mushroom zombies, which I'm going to call Spore Devotees. And these are cultists that are so devoted to Zuckmoy that they've allowed themselves to get infected with a variety of different mushroom spores. So I'm going to use the mud method and the dust method. And the only thing I'm going to change is their size from small to medium and their monster type from elemental to undead. And that doesn't really change any of their actual game mechanics significantly. But the reason I want to use the dust method is it has the ability to blind its opponents. And the mud method has the ability to restrain its opponents. So I can use these exact same abilities and just describe them differently. So the dust method mechanics I will describe as a cloud of spores that blind you. And the mud method, this sticky fungal ooze that traps you so that they can capture people and bring them back to the cult. So again, there's no significant change in mechanics. I'm not reworking any stats really at all. All I'm doing is just changing how I describe the actions at the table. The next method is changing ability scores and equipment, and this is easy to do with any of the humanoid monsters or NPC stat blocks in the monster manual. And now our cult needs some influencers. So we're going to create a pair of young elf nobles who are charismatic and charming, and they are really good at ushering people into worshiping Zuckmoy. So the first noble I'm going to build from the Goblin Boss stat block because I want her to be sly and crafty, and I want to represent that on the table with the nimble escape ability and the redirect attack ability from the Goblin Boss. But as we said before, she's very charming and she's a good leader. So we're going to up the wisdom and charisma to 16 to make it more apparent of how she's influencing other people and give her a better saving throw against the party members. Now the Goblin Boss has a chain shirt and a shield, and that doesn't really fit our noble very well. So we're instead going to give her mage armor and a dexterity of 18. So that preserves the armor class of 17 total, same as the Goblin Boss, but we do it in a different way that makes her look more like the character that we're describing, but still has the same mechanics as the Goblin. And next we have her brother, who I'm using the Hobgoblin Captain for, and we're also preserving his 17 armor class. However, we're going to do that by taking away his half-plate armor and giving him a +1 breastplate, and also increasing his dexterity score to 18 as well. I'm using the Hobgoblin Captain here because I want the martial advantage ability and the leadership ability, because I want this NPC to be good at bossing around the palace guards and using them in combat. And that's what you do here. You just find monster abilities you like that fit the theme of your NPC, and then you tinker with the stat block to make it even more like the NPC that you're trying to portray. So our next method of reflavoring monsters is spells and spell-like abilities. And since we're building a cult, of course we're going to use the Cultist and Cult Fanatic stat blocks. Now the Cultist stat block does not have any spells, but we're going to add the Infestation cantrip. And instead of describing it as a swarm of insects that are summoned by the Cultist, we're going to describe it as a little bomb of mushrooms that releases spores all over the target. So when those spores explode, you're coughing and hacking, and it forces you to move 5 feet away from the cloud of spores. Mechanically, it works the exact same as the Infestation cantrip. We're just describing the spell differently to reinforce the mushroom, fungi, demon queen theme. Now, the Cult Fanatic already has spells, so we're just going to change a few of them. It already has the command and hold person spells, which gives it that psychic flavor we want, and it already has inflict wounds that does necrotic damage. Again, that fits our theme. However, we're going to replace a couple of the spells and add Tasha's Mind Whip and the Mind Sliver cantrip to ramp up that psychic feel for our Mushroom Queen Cult Fanatic. And that's really a super simple way to change up the flavor of a monster, is just by adding the mechanics of a spell. Even if you're not describing it as the spell itself, you're just using those mechanics. You're not actually saying this monster cast this spell. You're just using the mechanics of that spell as an ability that the monster has. Another way to reflavor monsters is by adding class abilities, especially if you want an NPC that feels like it's a particular class. I think a lot of people forget about the stat blocks in the appendix at the back of the monster manual. You have the druid, the priest, the knight, the veteran, and the mage, all of which are super easy to adapt, and you just add class abilities or subclass abilities. This way you're not building a whole 10th level character for your big bad. And if you need an NPC that is a class type, you can just take some class abilities that you know you want to use and add it to one of those stat blocks. And that way you're not building a whole 10th level character with a bunch of abilities that you're never going to use. You only put in the abilities that you know you want to use. And since we're building a demonic cult, we're going to use a succubus and an incubus, and we're going to give him the druid subclass ability called Spreading Spores from the Spore Druid, so he can blast people with these 10-foot orbs of mushroom spores, make him a hot-tempered blaster type character. And to her, we're going to give the psionic power ability from the rogue soul knife subclass, and that makes her like one of my favorite X-Men, Psylocke. And one little extra tip about building factions, you want to add some dramatic tension that the player characters might be able to exploit. So I would put the incubus in a toxic relationship with the female noble, and the succubus in a love triangle with the male noble and the cult fanatic. So mushrooms, toxic relationships, love triangles, all we need is a little rock and roll, and this is going to feel like my high school years. Now we're getting close to the end of the list, and our next to last category is templates and special abilities. Now, some of the more powerful creatures in Dungeons & Dragons have special abilities that they can give to followers. So if you look past their stat block and go to the bottom of their description, you will find these special abilities listed. And demons and devils are the ones who most often have these, because they most often have followers. So since we're building the Cult of Zuckmoy, we'll take a look at her entry, and sure enough, she has a special ability called Spore Kist, which makes her followers immune to being charmed or frightened. We're going to take this ability and give it to several different stat blocks. We can give it to the Berserker to make like a wild bodyguard. We can give it to guards, those palace guards we talked about before. We can give this ability to any NPC that we want to help them be resistant to the players trying to manipulate and control the cult the way the cult is trying to manipulate and control everybody else. And the next thing we're going to look at here is templates. And templates are something that exists in the monster manual. There are not a lot of them. I really think there could be plenty more. But the one we're going to look at is the Spore Servant template from the Myconid entry. And of course, Myconids in the monster manual are mushroom folk, which fit our theme perfectly. So we're going to borrow their Spore Servant, because in D&D, the Myconids are able to cast their spores upon a dead creature and reanimate it and make it a Spore Servant. So we're going to give our cult that same ability, and because this is Dungeons and Dragons, we are going to have this cult with a pet mushroom dragon. So we can add this template to a dragon wormling, or even a young dragon, depending on how high a level the characters are getting as they battle their way through our Zuckmoy cult. So this is our last and final way to reflavor monsters, and I'm simply calling this Monster Mash. So this is where you just take 2 or 3 different monsters and you mix and match their abilities. When you look at a monster stat block, you'll see that they have abilities and actions. So you can take the actions from one monster and give it to another, or the abilities from a third monster and give it to the first one, and that allows you to customize your monsters how you want with the abilities and actions that are going to reinforce the theme and type of creature that you are designing. So once again, since this is the demonic cult, we're going to use main demons, these ugly, necrotic little demon minions, and we're going to make them the central part of our mushroom cult, because we're going to take the ability from our Myconid sovereign. Remember our mushroom folk? Well, they have a leader called a sovereign who has multiple different spore abilities. And we're going to take the hallucinogenic spore ability and give it to our main demons. That way, these little creepy demons kind of wander around the temples of Zuckmoy, and they slough off these spores, which make people have hallucinogenic trips. Therefore, the worship of Zuckmoy incorporates these kind of cuddle puddle of cultist followers who pile around these ugly little demons and rub off the spores off of this demon and get a hallucinogenic high. We're definitely getting kind of creepy and weird with this cult. And we got one last thing to add to our cult, because we need a big bad. We need the real leader behind all this madness. And that's going to be a shadow demon. And we're going to mash him up with our Myconid spore abilities. But this time we're going to give him the pacifying spore abilities. Because what's great about this is that pacifying spores cause a stun condition. And when somebody is stunned, you have advantage on attacks against them. And the Shadow Demon has the monster equivalent of sneak attack. So whenever they have advantage against a creature, they do extra damage. So all this adds up to make our Shadow Demon extra powerful, because it can stun a target and then deal extra damage to it and then disappear into the shadows and hit and run against the player characters. So there you have it, this creepy, weird cult that you can use with your players, and 12 different monsters that have a unique mix that reinforces the flavor of the adventure. I hope I didn't go overboard with the mushroom weirdness. I hope you like this idea. Let me know in the comments if you did. Also, let me know if this type of monster design was helpful for you. I think it's a real time saver and a great way to answer the question that I see a lot of times online: how do I stat this? The channel is almost at 4,000 subscribers. We only need about 100 and change to hit that 4,000 mark. So if you haven't subscribed, make sure you do. And thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time in the Dire Den. And if you're new to the channel, check out my most recent video here and my most watched playlist, How to Prepare a Campaign.